For those of you who don't know, because, well, you've probably never heard of me, several months ago I did a video on Bob Lazar and how credible his account of being at S4 and working on UFOs was. I've followed his story for a few years now, and I've always felt that based on the facts and knowledge that's out there, he's most likely not telling the truth. Let me just say that I have no personal issues with Bob Lazar. I actually think he's a very interesting individual. He's a great storyteller who seems to know what he's talking about, so it's never been a personal issue. I've just never really bought his story. However, whilst doing my morning browse of YouTube on the toilet this morning like I'm reading the paper, I kept seeing clips of him on Joe Rogan in my recommended section, and I thought, surely I haven't missed him appearing on the podcast, and it turns out it was released today, well, early hours of this morning for me here in the UK. So naturally, I had to watch it. And boy, what a good podcast it was. I mean, seriously, it's probably one of the best ones so far, in my opinion. That being said, in the opening half hour, I found that my heart rate went up every time he stumbled on a question or paused for too long, and then I realised I might be a bit biased here. So I decided to start again and try to watch it with an open mind. I wanted to get through this by being as impartial as possible. Regardless of what you think of Bob Lazar, there's something about him that's just so captivating. I feel like when he's talking, he really does seem to know what he's talking about. I mean, I'm not by any means a smart guy. I'm certainly no scientist, so a lot of what he says kind of goes over my head. Like, whenever he mentions gravity waves or reactors, I'm kind of like, oh yeah, I mean, I've seen Chernobyl. You mean like a nuclear reactor? So yeah, I only wish there was someone there, like a reputable scientist, who could just be like, well, hold on a second there, Bob. There is a guy with him, but it's the director of his Netflix documentary. His name's Jeremy Cornell, and he doesn't really offer much. He just seemed like a spare part, like a third wheel on a date or something. And as many people have pointed out in the comments, he seems to irk Joe Rogan up the wrong way. It seemed to me that whenever Rogan brought something up or made a point, Cornell would be like, oh yeah, you mean like this? And Rogan would be like, no, not at all. But you have to credit him for being there and actually helping Lazar really get his story out there. But yeah, I feel like Bob Lazar has a vibe about him that seems really genuine. When you see people bullshitting who you know are lying, they always have a particular way about them. I can't really put it down to anything specific, but I guess it's like a form of arrogance, like they're sick to death of repeating their made-up story and they're just waiting for their payday. But with Bob, I really don't get that. He seems really down to earth, and I actually get a real sense that he's not getting much joy out of telling his story. I can almost feel the impact it's actually having on him, like it's really affected him over the years. He has a real knack of overwhelming you with out-of-this-world information, yet at the same time he manages to keep it on a realistic wavelength, breaking it down and simplifying it for idiots like me. He doesn't try to oversell it or overload you with information to try and confuse you. I actually think he'd make a really good sci-fi writer, because all the best science fiction stories have crazy, futuristic scenarios, but they're still somewhat grounded to reality, so we get this sense of it not being totally far-fetched. I mean, think of movies such as The Matrix or Terminator. They're stories that on the face of it are unrealistic and the work of fiction, but because they're written so well and grounded to our reality, we enjoy them and let our imaginations run wild and think to ourselves, this could actually really happen. Like, how often do you hear talks on advanced AI programming, or how we could be living in a simulation created by aliens? And how often in these talks are films like The Matrix and Terminator referenced? This is what makes Bob Lazar's account so much more interesting. One thing Joe Rogan didn't really go into detail about was Lazar's lack of credentials and his rather muddled mess of an educational background. I realised Rogan wasn't really there to interrogate him as such, and felt this was probably more of an appreciation type of podcast. But this is one of the biggest red flags held against Bob Lazar, and he's never really spoke much about it, so it would have been great to hear what he has to say about it these days. And you know, if he had given a reasonable explanation, it might have been enough to turn even some of his biggest skeptics. Now, I know how bad memories can be at times. I myself am not even 30 yet, but whenever I fill out job applications, I still have to stop and think in some detail about what the years I graduated from schools and colleges were. I probably put that down to the sheer amount of alcohol I consumed in those 3 blurry years I'm told were university. However, For someone like Bob, who's had to tell his story over and over again, I'd have thought he'd know it like the back of his hand by now. But I digress. I haven't seen the documentary, by the way, so I don't know if there's much talk of it there, so pardon me if it's explained there. I should probably go and watch it if that's the case. So anyway, has my sceptical opinion of Bob Lazar changed? To put it simply, yeah, it has. In the absence of any proof like artefacts or just about anything concrete to analyse, all you can really do is judge a person's character. And with Lazar, his demeanour, attitude, and just the way he tells his story has never really changed. He's always seemed genuine and humble. So, if I were going to judge Lazar's story based purely on him as a person, I'd probably say he's telling the truth, or at least looks like he is. But bear in mind, we only really get to see him when he's in front of a camera. We don't know what he's like behind closed doors, so you'd be foolish to just assume how he is in front of a camera is exactly how he is all the time. This could all just be a clever facade. What I will say though is this story's been doing the rounds for the best part of 30 years now, which is a really long time when you think about it. And typically, people aren't really capable of keeping up bullshit for that long without changing the story or before they end up going crazy or letting slip that they're full of it. Lazar has managed to keep the same story going without making himself look like an idiot, which leads me to believe even more that he's quite possibly telling the truth. I'm not saying I totally believe his story, by the way, but what I will say is he's very convincing, and I'm gradually finding it harder and harder to dismiss him as a fraudster. I just hope now that some FBI agent or body language expert isn't now going to analyse him and basically tell us he is indeed lying and make me look like a tit. So yeah, I'd highly recommend you watch Rogan's podcast if you haven't already, so you can formulate your own opinions. Thanks very much for taking the time to listen to me rambling on. I know I don't have much of an audience out there, but I really enjoy talking about this kind of subjects, so I really do greatly appreciate it. Thanks.